You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Desperate Trump plans to use military on 2026 midterms, experts, based on an article by Matthew Ross. The midterms as a military problem. The real question is power. The source is not describing a constitutional curiosity. It is describing an attempted conversion of elections into a security theater problem, with Trump at the center and Republican enablers around him. The legal background matters, but only as the terrain Trump is trying to bulldoze. The point is not whether some clever lawyer can invent a loophole. The point is that the president and his allies are treating civilian voting as something the orange state should be allowed to supervise. The law is not the story, but the alibi. Lawfare's analysis is useful because it strips away the fantasy that this is normal executive behavior. The Constitution gives states the main role in administering elections. Congress has limited power to alter regulations, and the statutes that do speak clearly generally bar domestic military election interference. Posse Comitatus exists for a reason. So does the long legislative record protecting elections as a special category. None of that has stopped Trump from openly regretting that he did not seize voting machines in 2020, or Bannon from fantasizing about calling in the 82nd and 101st Airborne for 2026. That is not legal debate. It is an authoritarian rehearsal with footnotes. The goal is intimidation. The most important part of the story is not what troops would do. It is what their presence would make voters feel. Pooja Shohiri said the threat is the chilling effect, and that is exactly the right frame. If voters hear that ICE may be at the polls or that military personnel may be inserted into the voting process, many will stay home. Mixed status families, vulnerable communities, and ordinary citizens do not need to be physically blocked to be suppressed. They only need to be made unsure whether voting is worth the risk. That is why this should be read as voter suppression, not election administration. If ICE enters the picture, the response is not better training or better oversight. As is at LA, agencies built to terrorize communities should not be repurposed as neutral election infrastructure. The propaganda is the mechanism. Peak Hicks's false claim that troops were deployed to polling places in 15 states under Biden is not a harmless mistake. It is part of the normalization process. If the lie can be made to sound plausible, then the next lie becomes easier, and the next deployment becomes less shocking. That is how authoritarian politics works in practice, not by announcing the end of elections, but by laundering coercion through procedural language and invented precedent. The article's framing is weakest when it leaves room for this to sound like a technical dispute over statutory boundaries. The more accurate description is simpler. The people around Trump are testing how much intimidation the system will tolerate before it calls the move by its real name. Republicans want insulated power. Dan Vikinya's point cuts through the legal fog. This is about avoiding accountability in the midterms and preserving the ability to act without voter restraint. That means the story is not about protecting elections. It is about protecting power from elections. Trump's contempt for the vote is not abstract. It is consistent with the big lie, the pressure campaign against the 2020 result, and a violent attempt to overturn a free and fair election. The same mentality is now being pointed at 2026. This is why the story matters beyond one election cycle. The problem is not that a single president is unusually reckless. The problem is that Republican politics keeps producing a demand for state power that is unbound by democratic consent, then racks the demand in security language and institutional cowardice. The system behind the stunt. The larger pattern is not subtle. When democratic outcomes look unfavorable, authoritarian actors do not always try to win more votes. They try to make voting feel dangerous, counting feel contested, and enforcement feel optional. The military, ICE, false claims about past deployments, and legal improvisation are all parts of the same machine. The lesson is plain. Elections are being recast as a site where the state may threaten the public into submission. That is not a constitutional edge case. It is the political project. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article, with the automated voice of Ryan. Thanks for listening.